Start. Okay, so we're continuing now with the laws of Shmitta. Whoops. And last time we talked about the work that's forbidden. This time I want to talk about the fruit. We're getting into the things which are probably of more relevance to most of our people, and that is the fruits of Shviz. So, and we said before that the fruits of Shviz have a kedusha. So we say that the fruits of Shviz have a kedusha. That is that when I say again fruits, please remember that I don't just mean specifically fruits from trees. I mean all produce. But the Hebrew uses the word perus, so I'll use the word fruits. So there were 6 specific different dinim, different laws relating to the fruits of Shemitah, and 4 of them are from the Torah, and 2 of them are from the rabbis. So let's go through these in general first, and then we'll discuss each one specifically. The first thing is that a person who has fruits growing in his field of perus, of fruits of shviz, he has to mafkir them, has to make them hefka. That means he makes them ownerless. They're not mine. The fruits are not mine. They're ownerless. And we'll see how he has to mafkir them, how he has to make them ownerless, whether that happens automatically or whether he has to say something. We'll see that in a moment or two. That was number 1. They have to be ownerless. Hefka. Number 2 is that you're not allowed to destroy them or cause them to have any loss, because the Torah says that the fruit will be for you to eat. That means to eat and not to destroy or not to cause them loss. And we'll come into that in greater detail, what's called eating, regular eating, and what might be called loss. The second thing is that you're not allowed to trade in them because it says to eat and not as trade or as business. That's very important because that will govern how the people who have fruit growing, if they can sell them or distribute them, and how a customer can acquire them or buy them. So it's a very important law which we'll come to. And the next one is that what's called biur, which is at the time that they no longer grow in the field, you're not allowed to store them or keep them in your house. That while they could be eaten from the fruit, so then they can be eaten by a person or an animal, but when they are no longer growing in the field, so then they can no longer be eaten or kept in the house, and we'll see how we have to deal with that. So those are 4 laws of the Torah. Again, I repeat, you have to mafkir them. They cannot be owned. They have to be ownerless. Can't cause them any loss or destroy them. They're to be eaten and not to be destroyed, and that we'll discuss. That includes all kinds of problems about whether you're allowed to blend them, etc., how you're allowed to eat them, whether they have to be cooked, or food that's cooked has to be cooked, food that's not cooked should not be cooked. We'll see those details. Then very important, you're not allowed to trade with them or do business with them, and that will affect how they're sold and how they can be bought. If they can be sold, if they can be bought, then the question of biur, that you have to see that you don't keep them after the time that they're grown. And those are 4 details, laws of the Torah. And the rabbis added 2 laws. One which is very important is called svichim. Svichim are fruit of the earth, vegetables, things that grow from the earth, not from trees, which grow in the 7th year. The rabbis say, even though from the Torah you're allowed to eat them, the rabbis say you're not allowed to eat them and you're not allowed to use them. The reason being that we are concerned, let's say if they grow on their own, you should be allowed to eat them, but we're concerned that people will grow the fruit, the vegetables, and claim they grew on their own, and therefore we make vegetables and crops other than fruit of trees which grow in the 7th year. You're not allowed to pick them or eat them, or you're supposed to pick them but not to eat them. You pick them to we'll see, so that they cannot be eaten, and we'll see in general to what produce that applies and what produce it doesn't apply. And then the last law is that you're not supposed to, from the rabbis, you're not supposed to take these fruits from to chutz la'aretz. This is particularly applicable to wine. We'll see what about wine that comes in the 7th year, whether you can eat it or drink it rather, according to the special conditions that we learn, but maybe you're not allowed to send that to chutz la'aretz. Okay. So we have to discuss what kind of fruit has kedusha and what time in terms of its growing is there kedusha, and does it depend on who owns the land and what the place is. So we'll start off by saying this. In general, the kedusha of Shvis falls on things that are grown from the ground to eat, specifically for food, not just food for man, but also food for an animal, and not only for food, but also if it's used for anointing. Let's say there's certain kinds of oil that grows from fruit which is specifically used for anointing, or for creams, oils. Those are also governed by the laws of Shmitta, and they have kedusha. Also for lighting, again, oil. If we, let's say, comes from olives or other produce which has oil, so the kedusha applies also to that, and also for dyeing. Maybe for a person, for makeup, or dyeing for clothes, and also for fragrance, so that the law of Shmitta applies. Let's summarize this. The law of Shmitta, when it applies for produce that's eaten. It applies for produce that's eaten for animals. It applies for produce that's used for anointing. It applies to produce that's used for dyeing and for fragrance, roses, things like that, flowers that have fragrance. The question of plants that are used for medicinal purpose is a complex question, and I think I'll give a special class on that later on. So now, the laws of Kedusha Shmius, as I said, apply to the crop itself. Now let's say that you have wood, for example, that you use for firewood. Well, there, the benefit that we're getting from the wood comes really after I use it up, after I destroy it, after I burn it. So therefore, wood that's used for burning is not subject to Kedusha Shvius, because I'm not getting benefit from the plant, I'm getting benefit subsequently after I burn up or use the plant. So therefore, firewood, let's say I have a tree which is not a fruit tree, a tree which is grown for firewood, so the wood does not have the Kedusha of Shmiras. There may be special laws as to how I can cut that wood. We'll come to that in due course. Now, I said that the law of Shmitta applies to flowers which have a fragrance, because the fragrance is something that is real. We have Gomorrahs where the fragrance has a separate existence. But if they don't, is not considered an actual enjoyment of the physical plant. Of course, eating is such, but also and you can buy and deal with the fruit of Shmitta. We'll see that flowers that have a fragrance fall within the definition of fruit of Shmitta, and there will be special laws that apply to that. But if they're simply for beauty, they're nice, but they don't have the laws of Shmitta. And therefore, if I have flowers which have no fragrance at all, I can grow them and sell them and buy them. They're not subject to the laws of Shmitta. Now, we said that the law of the Shemitah year begins on Rosh Hashanah and continues to the following Rosh Hashanah. But that doesn't necessarily apply to the fruit. The question of whether the produce is subject to the laws of Shemitah depends on what kind of fruit it is. And there are really what kind of produce it is. And there are three principal separate classifications of this produce which have different laws as to see whether that produce is called produce of the Shemitah. So the first thing we'd say is Yerokot, is vegetables, plants that grow from the ground, and we pick them. So those, they depend on the time you pick them, on the time you remove them from the place of growth. If it's vegetables, you pick them from the earth, etc. So now, if they are picked in the Shemitah year, so then they have Kedusha Shvius, even though maybe they were grown in the 6th year. So let's say you have nice vegetables growing now. They're not Shemitah if you pick them now, but if you wait until after Rosh Hashanah and you pick them, even though the plant was fully grown in the 6th year, vegetables or things that you pick as a whole, the plant, so that Shemitah applies to the time you pick them, not the time that they grow. And therefore, if I pick them in the Shemitah year, they have a din of Shemitah. If I pick them after the Shemitah year, they don't necessarily have a din of Shemitah, but we'll see, maybe there's going to be a problem. If I planted them, I'm not allowed to plant them in the Shemitah year. So again, vegetables and the like depend on when I pick them. But now I have a special law applying to olives, grapes, crop wheat and those kinds of grains, and what are called kidneys, legumes, peas, beans, things like that. So there, it's interesting because we're going to see in a moment that fruit of trees has its own law, but olives and grapes are included in this second category, which is of grains and legumes, olives and grapes. That depends on whether they grew a third in the Shemitah year. If they had already grown a third of their normal growth before the Shemitah year, then they are not considered the fruit of the Shemitah year, they are considered the fruit of the previous year. But if they reach a third of their growth in the Shemitah year, so then they have Kedusha Shvis. Even if they were planted or they were in the 6th year, if they haven't yet reached a third of their growth before Rosh Hashanah, then they will be considered produce of the Shemitah year. Trying to think, probably grapes have not yet reached a third of their growth, and olives I don't think, I'm not sure, but I doubt whether olives have yet reached a third of their growth. And grains, etc., depends. If they had, again, I repeat, if they had already got a third of their growth before Rosh Hashanah, they're not considered produce of the Shemitah year, and they don't have Kedusha. If they reach a third of their growth during the Shemitah year, then they're called produce of the Shemitah year, and they have Kedusha. So that's the second category. Now the third category is fruit of trees. So there, it's not the time you pick them. It doesn't depend on whether I pick them or when I pick them. It doesn't depend on when they have reached a third. It depends on what's called chanata. Chanata is like budding. They usually say after the flower, if you have a fruit tree, first you have the flowers and then the flower falls off and you see tiny little buds. Those little buds are called the chanata. So if those buds come into being, some say that's a third of their growth, but some say not necessarily. It's when you recognize that they have these little buds. So if the budding was already in the 6th year, for example, in a garden you have fruit which is late growing, maybe some plums are late growing, and they will really be ripe in the 7th year after Rosh Hashanah. But if they budded in the 6th year, then they're not liable to Shemitah. And of course, the converse applies. If they're going to bud next year, even though they're not fully ripe in the Shemitah year, if they budded in the 7th year, then they are subject to Shemitah. So let's repeat these 3 categories. Vegetables, when I pick them, olives, grapes, and legumes and grains, when they've reached a third of their growth. That's what if they reach a third of their growth in Shemitah. And fruit, when they bud. If they, I suppose budding is a very significant, it's like the beginning of the fruit, right? In a sense, the beginning of the fruit is earlier, but that's flowers. So when you begin to see the tiny little buds, that's the time that they're considered fruit of that year. And if that happens in the Shemitah year, they're liable to Shemitah. And Derech Agav, on the way, we'll see that there's a very interesting law relating to etrog. I'll give a class on the Arba Minim, the 4 Minim that we're going to use for Sukkot. But etrog is interesting because etrog is a fruit of a tree. Right? It's similar to a lemon tree. It's a tree of that family. But nevertheless, the Gemara is unclear. There's no certain certainty in the Gemara whether an etrog is considered as a fruit of the tree, in which case it would go after when it buds, or if it's considered like a vegetable. Not that it is a vegetable, but I think it's because it needs a lot of water. An etrog tree needs constant water. Most fruit trees are able to grow and produce fruit. Of course, we water them to improve the quality, but they can usually survive if they're planted in a place which is naturally irrigated. But etrog needs a lot of water, so therefore they're similar in that respect to vegetables, which need a lot of water. So there's a difference of opinion and a question in the Gemara as to whether etrogim are considered fruit, which depends on when they're bad, or are they considered vegetables, according to which when we pick them. So because of that, we are strict. And we say, if they budded on the 6th year, but they're picked on the 7th year, so the Rambam says, well, even though they're budded in the 6th year like other fruits, since they're picked on the 7th year, we should have they should have Kedusha Shvius. So therefore, when we buy etrogs this year, we should make sure they're not picked during the Shmitta year. And on the other hand, the following year when we buy etrogs, we have to make sure that they were not first budded in the 7th year. So etrogs are specifically strict, and we have to be careful, as I say, that they're not picked in the 7th year, and also they don't bud in the 7th year. Therefore, Motzi Shmitta, an etrog which was budded in the 7th year has Kedusha Shmitta, and we'll see whether you're not allowed to use that as one of the Arba Minim, because it's not being used to eat. Okay, but other plants, fruit of that nature, oranges, apples, etc., those that go like all other fruit, which is when they bud. So that means, in general, that oranges, lemons, stuff like that you're buying now, you'll buy just after Shmitta, they probably budded beforehand, and they won't have Kedusha Shmitta. It will be the ones that come out in the 8th year that have Kedusha Shmitta. Okay. The next question is, who owns the land? It's a very key question. It affects us because a lot of the produce that will be eaten in the Shemitah year comes from land which is, quote, owned and farmed by Arabs. So there's a difference of opinion between the Shulchan Aruch, the Beis Yosef, who says that if the land is in the ownership, I'm not going to go into political questions, but simply speaking, it's in the ownership of Arabs and it's farmed by Arabs, then there is no Kedusha Shmitta, and they can be bought simply, and as I said, that's really the view that the rabbis of Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, took, that our produce doesn't have Kedusha. And as I said, I remember some Shemitah years ago, you could go into the Arab shuk and buy as much vegetables as you want to from the Arab shops. However, that was the opinion of the Beis Yosef, the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo, But about the same time, I think perhaps he was a bit older, there was the chief rabbi of Tzfat, called the Mabit, and he said, no, 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 because this is a Gemara, and there are two views in the Gemara. He says, no, the produce of land owned by Arabs and farmed by Arabs still has Kedusha Shmitta. We'll see that that they're not the same restrictions as to what are called svichim. In other words, the Jew's not allowed to pick vegetables in his land, in his fields, which grow in the Shemitah year. An Arab is allowed to pick them. He doesn't have any problem about picking them. And the Arab himself is not liable to the laws of Shemitah. So I suppose he can buy and sell them as he wishes. However, if they have Kedusha Shmitta, so that will affect the Jew, and the Jew will therefore not be allowed to buy them as if they were produce which had no Kedusha. They have Kedusha, and therefore the restrictions that we're going to learn about how he acquires them and how he uses them, what he does with the peels, etc. All that applies to Arab produce. It's a very important fundamental question, whether ownership of the land by non-Jews removes the Kedusha. So that really depends on whether we say the Kedusha is related to the person who is growing it. So if he's not Jewish, there's no Kedusha. Or no, the Kedusha relates to the land of Israel and the produce of Israel, and therefore Kedusha applies to it. Very deep question. And as I said in the previous class, the question of whether there is Kedusha from the Torah or not depends on different views. One is that it's not until a long time to come when we're going to have the Yovel, the 50th year, and because then everyone goes back to their designated family land, and we don't know at the moment whose land is, what our designated land is, what our tribe is, etc. So that will require a later stage in the Geula, in the redemption, when we have know which tribe everyone belongs to, and everyone is sitting on his own land. But according to the Shulchan Aruch, that's not the key. The key is if the majority of Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael. Well, I mean, that's a very difficult thing to know. Who's a Jew for this purpose and how's you come? But in general, we might think that nowadays we're at a stage where it's quite possible that the majority of Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, the Kedusha of the land is from the Torah. And there is no doubt at all that the land now has a tremendous Kedusha. It has a beautiful growth of all these fruits and vegetables, the richness of Eretz Yisrael, and that's related to the Kedusha. So, although previous years there was generally a distinction, the people in Yerushalayim and the surrounding areas held, like the rabbis of Jerusalem, and particularly the Hasidim, that there was no Kedusha if they on Arab land. But nowadays, more and more people are coming to the opinion that there is Kedusha, even if there is, if the produce is Arab. First of all, you have to make sure that it is Arab, that they don't load up their trucks from produce from Israeli kibbutzim and sell them as Arab land. But even if we know that that's so the question of the Kedusha applies, which will affect how we're able to buy. Because, as I said right at the beginning, the fruit, the produce, which has Kedusha, cannot be bought or sold in the normal way. You can eat it, But how you acquire it in order to eat it will depend on various laws. So that is a key question relating to the ownership of the land. Interesting question. Let's say a person doesn't hold that there is Kedusha in the produce of the Arabs, and if he buys Arab vegetables, whatever, he cooks them up and he invites someone to eat by him who does hold the Kedusha. So it would be proper for him to tell the person, look, there's no Kedusha and this food doesn't have Kedusha, and then he has to decide, the person who's eating by him, whether he will accept the other person's produce because he's a guest in his house and he doesn't want to offend him, or whether he's going to be strict and say, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to eat it. This is also very relevant, of course, when we come to eating in restaurants or in functions, and also whether, I haven't talked at this point about the Heter Mechira, because I've said that we in general don't hold by the Heter Mechira. I repeat what I said before because it's very important, since the majority of the country doesn't observe Shmitta, and to some extent they rely on what's called the Heter Mechira, which means they go through a process which sells the top surface of the land to Arabs, so then it's Arab land, and they hold that Arab land doesn't have Kedusha. But there's a problem with that. First of all, people say, well, we all, on Pesach, we most people sell their chametz to a non-Jew. So what's the difference between Heter Mechira, where we sell the topsoil, to a non-Jew? Well, there's a very important difference, because in Pesach, even though I sell my chametz to a non-Jew, I'm not allowed to eat it on Pesach. It has to be locked up and put away. So the Heter Mechira is a way to enable people to eat it. So it's not comparable really to Pesach. And as I say, in general, we do not hold by a Heter Mechira, but it may be that in cases of emergency, someone's in a hospital or in the army or in other circumstances, or that's the only food available, he may eat it. And then also the question is what to do with that produce. In a case where a particular store bought a lot of wine, which turned out to be Heter Mechira, so he didn't want to sell it because it has Kedusha, so he left it hefker outside. But if it has Kedusha, you're not allowed to waste it or pour it away or destroy it. It's not, God forbid, treif. Fruit is not treif. The question is if it has Kedusha. So if it's left outside or it's made hefker, then in my opinion, subject to the rules which we're going to have about acquiring hefker produce, it would not be forbidden for the person to take it, and if it was wine, to drink it, or food, to eat it, provided it was not acquired in a way that would offend the laws of Kedusha. Okay, so the next thing is, where does the Shemitah law apply? So first of all, it only applies in Eretz Yisrael. The law is quite clear. It says, Ki tavau el haaretz, when you come to Eretz Yisrael. It doesn't apply to produce outside of Eretz Yisrael. Of course, the question will be, how do we define Eretz Yisrael? in general, we talk about Eretz Yisrael as the land that was occupied on the second coming. That's to say, when we came from Babel or Persia at the time of Ezra. So that means there are questions previously of Gush Katif, and that was under Jewish occupation. Questions on the south going to Iraq, questions on the other side of the Jordan, questions on what was called Syria. But we don't really know specifically what those places are that were occupied. And in general, therefore, we say that all of Eretz Yisrael, what we call Eretz Yisrael, is subject to the laws of Shmitta. And the question of going south towards Eilat, various rabbis have different opinions as to which is Eretz Yisrael. And when you buy that produce, you'll go according to the hechsher of the particular rabbis to see whether there is the law of Shemitah applying it. And for example, the other side, the East Bank, was maybe considered Eretz Yisrael for the law of Shemitah, but the law of speaking, which I'll come to next, doesn't apply to that. Okay. If it's outside the normal boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, then the law of Shemitah doesn't apply. Okay, so now let's go into the specific laws that was like a general overview. So let's go now into certain specific laws. The first law is that we said that the produce has to be what's called hefker, which is ownerless. And that means that ownership has to be given up. So the question is, how is that done? Well, there's two views. One is that, and this is again an argument between the Beit Yosef and the Mabit, the chief rabbi Sfat around that time. So according to the Beit Yosef, there's a mitzvah on the person who owns the field. It's similar to the dispute, the question of whether Shemitah applies to our produce or not. So the Beit Yosef holds depends on the person. The same here, the obligation of hefker depends on the person. And therefore he says that the person who owns a field with fruit in it, produce of the Shemitah, has to mafkin, has to make it hefker. And unless he does that, it's not hefker. Whereas the Mabit holds, no, it's from the Torah, the Almighty makes it hefker. It doesn't depend on the man making it hefker. It is in itself hefker. In the same way as he holds it in self-kedusha, not depending on who owns the field. So therefore, it is hefker itself, even though the owners did not mafker it. So that makes a big difference. According to the people who say that the whole like the Beit Yosef, that the owner has to hefker it. So he has to hefker it. But he has to say, I hefker it. And it has to be in front of three people, which is the general rule of hefker. You have something that you don't want, you want to give up ownership. So in general, you have to say, I mafker this, I give up ownership. And that has to be three people. Why three people, not two? Normally you need two witnesses. So we say three people because it's like a din of beit din, it's a din of court. So in front of a court, he says he's mafkir. So what does it mean he has the hefker, the mafkir, the fruit? Well, let's say I own in my garden, I have fruit trees. Do I mafkir the land? No, of course I don't mafkir the land. No one can come in and take my land. No one can come and take someone else's field because it's the fruit. What about the tree? The tree itself is also not hefker. Someone can't come along and say, well, it's hefker, I'm going to dig it all up and take your tree away. The tree, in the same way that the land is still relevant to ownership and the person who owns the land still owns it. So also the fruit, but also the tree, but the fruit is hefker. What does it mean the fruit is hefker? That means two things. One is it means that anyone can come along and take the fruit. I can't run out of my door and see someone coming and taking the fruit from the tree and say, hey, hands off, that's my fruit. It's not my fruit, it's hefker. But what about coming into the land? It's no good the fruit being hefker if I have a wall with barbed wire all around it so no one can come in. It follows that if the fruit is hefker, so therefore I also have to allow a person to come into my land to take it. Otherwise, there's no value in the hefker. So therefore, it would follow according to the law of hefker, I have to keep my field open and allow people to come in at will to take the fruit. But what about if I'm worried that people will come in and they'll damage my land? Or they'll take things which are not hefker? Or they'll even try and steal the land. So therefore, if I am concerned that I don't want people to come freely into my land, I am allowed to close my land, and if there's a gate or something, I'm allowed to close it, but I have to have a sign clearly stating that the fruit is hefker, and anyone who wants to come into the fruit can do so, and they can contact me with a phone number or at certain times, whatever. So therefore, I have to make it accessible. I can't pretend that it's hefker, but no one can come and take it. I have to make it accessible. That's number one. And number two, if it's hefker so people can eat it. Only Jews, by the way. Lechem. It's hefker that Jews can come and eat it, but I can stop non-Jews coming to take it. And therefore, as I say, I'm allowed to close the field and allow people to come to it. Now, when they can come and take it, it's hefker, how much can they take? They're only allowed, since it's only for eating, they're only allowed to take what is for normal eating. How much is normal eating? Not specifically only enough for one meal. There's certain things that you would have in your house, you would keep for a couple of days. So you could take enough to have a couple of meals or to have it last for a few days. Not a great quantity on the one hand, and not just limited to one or two. So that, I remember there was, probably still is, minhag that at the time of Shmitta, sometimes in schools and things like that, they would take a bus and they would go out to the fields, and where you found a field or a farm where the people kept the Shmitta year, the kids or whoever was on the bus could go in and take a reasonable amount to last them for a day or two. And they don't need their permission to do it. Okay. but you're not allowed to keep more than you need because that's really considered like dealing or trading. So now let's just start with this very important subject matter, what's called speaking. Now, we said, according to the Torah, that the produce of the Shmitta year can be eaten. It's not for trade, and it's not to be destroyed, but it is to be eaten. So from the Torah, that would apply to all the categories of food that I mentioned, produce that I mentioned before. Let's say the three categories: vegetables, olives and grapes and legumes and grain, and also fruit of the trees. But you're not allowed to plant. So let's talk about vegetables. So normally speaking, the vegetables that are picked are grown in the same year. After Rosh Hashanah, someone might plant lettuce, carrots, tomatoes and the like, and eat them later in the year, but you're not allowed to plant them. But you are allowed to eat them if they were planted the year before. What about if they grow on their own? A lot of stuff grows on its own. You have seeds that drop, and the crop comes up. So you could say, well, I didn't plant it, it grew on its own, and I'm allowed to eat it. I won't now go into the question of trading and dealing, but I'm certainly allowed to eat it and pick it and eat it. But the rabbis are aware of the foibles of human nature, and we are concerned that if we allow people to pick vegetables, let's say, that claim they grew on their own, people will plant them and then say, well, they grew on their own. So therefore we make a blanket, a blanket rabbinical decree that you're not allowed to eat fruit of the land, that specifically, let's say, vegetables, and also perhaps grains and legumes that grow in the seventh year, because we're concerned that maybe they were planted in the seventh year. And therefore, it doesn't apply to fruit of trees, because there's no reality. It's not that someone's going to plant a tree and the fruit will come in the first year. First of all, it's forbidden the first 3 years. But anyway, generally fruit doesn't grow in the first year. But so far as vegetables are concerned, and also grain, and legumes, we have a rule that you cannot use, pick, or eat produce that grows those kinds of plants, vegetables, in the third year. And not only that, really you're supposed to, if they are growing, you're supposed to pick them up and throw them away so that people won't come to eat them. And even if the fruit does grow on its own, even if the vegetables do grow on their own, you're not allowed to eat it, because we make a blanket regulation from the Torah that you can't eat it, because people may come to grow them. So fruit of the Priyadoma, things you say, Priyadoma, are, even if they are not allowed to be eaten during the seventh year. But that only applies to where there's a question that people may grow them. So as I say, fruit of trees doesn't apply. And if you have things that grow in a place where normally you don't grow vegetables, let's say you have a field which is doesn't have any irrigation, and it's in a vineyard where you don't normally grow vegetables because you're going to have trouble because of Kalayim, and in any kind of a part of ground that is not normally used for growing vegetables, so then that rule doesn't apply to it. And that also applies to kinds of things that people don't normally grow. There are certain kinds of herbs or berries or wild plants that people don't normally grow, so therefore they may not be forbidden under the law of Shmitta. If someone wants to, I don't know about dandelions, for example. Some people grow dandelions to put in salad, but I don't know if that's so common. So you might have a herb or a dandelion that's not normally grown for produce. So maybe that, if it's not grown, it grows on itself. So maybe that may be allowed to. And also, the field which is owned by a non-Jew, they don't have an Issa of speaking. So even if we're going to say that there was a Kedusha of our produce, vegetables, but that doesn't mean you're not allowed to eat them. It means that you have to deal with it with Kedusha, how you acquire them, you're not allowed to buy them individually. We'll come to the question of how we're able to acquire them in the next lecture. So this applies also not only to food which is for humans, but it also applies to animal food. Animal food that grows in a field which is owned by a Jew or which is worked by a Jew is forbidden. It's very important that it doesn't necessarily just go on the ownership, it also goes on who owns the land. So let's say you have a non-Jew who has land in Eretz Israel and he hires Jews to work the land, so then the law of Shemitah will also apply to that. And also if it's Hefker, if I say my field, I don't know, my field is Hefker, anyone who wants to come in can use it, still and all there will be an Issa of Slicha. And now let's go back to the question of legumes and grain. So we said if they come to a third of their growth in the year of Shemitah, even if they were planted in the 6th year, if you plant them late in the 6th year like now, but they haven't grown a third and they grow a third in the Shemitah year, so then the question would be if they have this law of Slicha. So if they first begin to grow in the 7th year, so then they have the issue of Slicha. But if they were planted and they started to grow before the year of Shemitah, even though we may say they have Kedusha Shemitah because they're going to be picked in Shemitah, or third will come in Shemitah, nevertheless, they don't have this issue of Slicha. Some say yes and some say no. On the question, as I say, of kidneys, of legume and grains, whether if they were planted beforehand, they have a din of Slicha and you're not allowed to use them or no. Since they were planted beforehand, they're not forbidden to eat, or they're subject to the laws of Kedusha. We have special rules as well that these speaking you're not allowed to use for the thing which they're grown for. So if they're grown for food for man, a man can't eat. If they're animal food, a man can't. If they're animal food, then they're not allowed to be given to animals. If they're for fragrance, you're not allowed to use them for fragrance. And as I said, in addition to the fact you're not allowed to use them, but you have to uproot them so that no one else will come to use them. And I think if he doesn't uproot them, then when no one's looking, they'll come to eat them. So you have to uproot them, and then you have to leave them in a place where they'll rot so that no one else can come along and pick them up. And we said that that does not apply to fruit trees, and but that is a very important rule which will govern which vegetables we're allowed to buy and which we're not. Okay, so I think that's a good introduction to this topic, and we'll continue. Particularly, I think next week I want to talk about what I'm allowed to use this fruit for, the fruit of Kedusha. I'm not allowed to cause it any loss, and how I can use it, for what purposes I can use it. It's very relevant these days for people, as I said, they blend or they crush them, etc., etc. So please, God, next week we'll talk about